Jenny, can you tell us anything more about a possible tour for people interested in the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, so Ernie Kimmel and Gabrielle have a friend who gives tours for the Kennett Underground Railroad. Her name's Michelle. And so we're in the process now of choosing a date and a time. It'll be sometime either June or July for those that are interested to be part of a bus tour to sites of the Underground Railroad in the Kennett area. So once we settle on all of that, I'll send an email out to the class that those who might be interested with information about it to let me know, because they have two size buses. There's one that can take 24 people and one that's bigger. She recommends the smaller bus in that the bigger one has difficulty making turns on some of the sites we would go to. But, we'll want to get a head count of those that are interested. So, like I said, stay tuned. I'll be sent, once we settle on that, I'll send out the date and time and all of that. I think at this point, we're talking about probably a $10 charge per person. We have some funds available to us from Outreach Committee to help fund the trip. So stay tuned.
You're only talking Pennsylvania, right, Jenny?
Pennsylvania, Kennett Square area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 2 hours that we'll
It's like a
spend.
2-hour tour.
Can we get you to make a road trip out to the eastern part of Pennsylvania? Join us?
We're closer. We're in Delaware right now.
Oh, are you? Oh, well.
How long?
We looked up the Harry Beecher Stowe House, which is in Maryland, and that's not that far. We thought we'd take a drive.
Well, and Harriet Tubman.
Tubman. Right.
Tubman.
Yeah, that's down that way.
Further.
And if you're traveling around St. Michael's, Maryland, you can also find the places where Frederick Douglass was.
Mm-hmm. They actually, on the local news down here, they have a segment that they do and takes you to some of these historical sites around the peninsula.
All right.
Hi, Chris.
I'm here. Sorry I'm late. I got caught up in conversations at church. I mean, who would have thought? So yeah, no, I just happened to look at the clock and saw that it was 11:31, and Don said, "You better get out there." So I'm here now. It's wonderful to see everybody, and yeah, we'll probably have a few more people trickle in here and there. But let me invite us all to open with a word of prayer. This is a prayer from, I think I've used this before, this book of uncommon, well, I guess you can't see it. This book of uncommon prayer collects for the Black Lives Matter movement and beyond by Kenji Kiramitsu, who has worked or does work with evangelicals for social action. This prayer is called a prayer for justice, and it may sound somewhat familiar because it is inspired by the prayer that's attributed to Saint Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. So let's pray. God, make us instruments of your justice. Where there is a false and untenable peace, let us sow dissent. Where there is injustice, fury. Where there is oppression, hope. Where there is false fluorescence, profound darkness. Where there is social depression, life. Where there is crime and poverty, a sustainable economic infrastructure. Grant that we may not so much seek to be uplifted as to uplift, to be seen as to see others. For it is in protesting the sin of the system that we can more fully acknowledge our own sin. It is in demanding justice of the powerful that we live out God's demands for us. and it is in rejecting the American dream that we are born into God's dream. Amen.
And
Amen.
So we're in the last week of How to Fight Racism with Jamar Tisby's book, and I'll have two videos today. One is a longer one on the last chapter, and then I'll have a brief one. I think it's about 4 to 5 minutes. That's just on the conclusion and some ending encouragement, I'll say, from Jamar. So we've been through a lot. You know, many of us have been through 2 book studies now with The Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism. And this week, one of the things that I think this last chapter is really getting us to think about is the longevity of our practice, of our involvement, of our work, of our faithfulness in anti-racism. Because once this book study is done, you know, the work isn't over, and we have to figure out how to keep going. And one of the things that we'll kind of hear in this video is sort of our consciousness of race. And so the opening question I want to offer you before we play this video is, how do you, as I believe everyone here is white, how do you remain conscious of race even when you're in situations or circumstances where you don't have to? So that's the opening question. How do you remain conscious of race when you're in situations or circumstances where you don't have to? So if a couple people want to offer their answer or their brief reflection.
Well, simply, you know, just by reading the newspaper and watching the news on television, race comes up a lot now. Different marches and protests. So I try to stay up to date by listening to the media.
So just being willing to pay attention to what's going on in various ways. Yeah. Susan Kelly.
I think it's also being analytical about what you're hearing. It reminds me of like a scenario where I think you said, and I think you know what I said, but maybe you don't know. And, you know, you dig a little deeper and consider the source and be a bit analytical, or a lot analytical as need be.
Absolutely. Susan Morris.
I'm kind of looking at it from a slightly different angle and thinking that when I'm in a large group or gathering of friends, where we're all white, to be conscious of the fact of the just innate benefits we have had in life, because of that simple fact, and to be aware that, you know, not everybody gets to do what I'm doing right now, and therefore to be more aware of how that could be made more equal.
Yeah. One more, Betsy Ballantyne.
I hope you can see this. My daughter just posted this because, as you know, yesterday was Loving Day, which was the day that they legalized biracial marriage. Can you see that?
It's a little dark. Oh, yes. Okay. I think we can see it.
Oh,
There you go.
there's my daughter and her husband, and there's their 3 boys. So every day, that's what I live. And that's how it is. And it's been I remember being stopped at a flea market in an evangelical church with Aiden, who's now 17, on my hip as a child. And somebody stopping, laying their hands on me and praying for me, because I was such a wonderful person for adopting this child. It's just black. I mean, come on. Anyway, my story.
Yeah. No, that's a one. Thank you for sharing that. That's a just a beautiful witness to the longevity of, you know, the faithfulness of people's work in this before us, and people who have struggled, and you know, they're seeing the fruits of this long struggle that we're continuing to engage in. Yeah, so I think that's a great lead into our video. And the video is on how we can not just fight for racism, or fight against racism, but orient our entire lives around fighting racism and anti-racist work. So let me share my screen here. Is everyone able to see? Okay, let me.
Living in the Deep South has been incredibly formative in my journey toward racial justice. It's living here that brought me into an encounter with historical figures such as Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, James Meredith, Medgar Evers, just to name a few. And when I think of their lives and how they struggled for freedom under conditions far more dire than even my own today, when I think about my ancestors, I can't help but to continue their struggle. But as we think about the fight against racism, we shouldn't conceive of it just as a series of isolated actions. It's more than that. It's about an attitude, about a disposition, an orientation of one's entire life toward racial justice. And so this section is about orienting or reorienting our lives spiritually, economically, culturally, politically, toward the good of our neighbor. According to a popular story, The Times, a newspaper in London, once asked the question of its readers, "What is wrong with the world?" To which popular author G.K. Chesterton replied, "Dear sirs, I am." There's a principle that Chesterton was articulating there, that when it comes to racism, all of us are caught up in the problem, and all of us have a responsibility to work toward solutions. In the Bible, in the book of Philippians, it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but out of humility consider others better than yourselves." In terms of orienting our lives toward racial justice, an essential understanding that we have to have is humility. One part of humility is realizing that we too can be a cause of racism and racial problems, even people of color sometimes. I remember as a principal, I had a teacher who was of Asian descent. She was in her first year, and so I had a lot of feedback and correction to give her, and whenever I would talk to her about it, she would always look down. And I couldn't understand it. It was like, if I'm talking to you, look at me. It's a sign of respect. Well, one day after another one of these episodes, she came to my office and she said, "Listen, in my culture, it's considered disrespectful to look an authority figure in the eyes, and so we look down. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful to you. As a matter of fact, I was trying to show respect." That was an error on my part. I had misunderstood the cultural cues, and I had to apologize and change my behavior after that. But that's what it takes to orient your life toward racial justice. The humility to recognize that at some point, all of us can act in racist ways, but at the same time, all of us have the responsibility to work toward solutions, and we can learn from other people as we do so. Another essential understanding in orienting one's life toward racial justice is that we have to keep the light switch on. You know, there's a big difference between a light switch and a smoke alarm. A light switch you can turn on and off. A smoke alarm stays on. For many white people, racial justice is like a light switch. You can turn it off and on as it is convenient for you. But for people of color, racial and ethnic minorities, it's more like a smoke alarm. It remains on all the time so that we can detect danger and remain in safety. Whether we want to or not, as racial and ethnic minorities, we always have to be thinking about racism and white supremacy because you never know when or how it will affect you. But for white people, because we live in a society that rewards whiteness and centers white people in so many different ways, there is a sense in which you can get along without thinking much about race or racial justice. Now, I would argue that that is still damaging and detrimental even to white people, but there's a way that you can maneuver in the world, and sometimes you pay attention to race and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have that light switch on and sometimes you have it off. That's how we can get a period when, say, the next unarmed black person is killed by law enforcement. White people will march, they'll tweet, they'll talk about it for a little while. And then it goes back to business as usual, because the costs of keeping that light switch on for racial justice require constant attention and energy and focus, and turning it off is so much easier and more comfortable. But if you want to orient your life toward racial justice, if you want to express genuine solidarity with the marginalized and oppressed, then you need to keep that light switch on, even when you could turn it off. In terms of racial justice practices, orienting your life toward racism is incredibly difficult, but it's also incredibly powerful. It's difficult because you have to rearrange things, but it's powerful because you can do it. You have the choice. One of the simplest racial justice practices in orienting our lives toward racial justice is budgeting our time. This seems very obvious, and yet we seldom think of it. So if you think about doing racial justice, about practicing racial justice, it takes time. If you're going to make phone calls or attend a march or go to a meeting, all of that takes time. And so orienting your life toward racial justice means auditing your time and budgeting some time toward these racial justice practices. One thing you might do is look at the organizations or the causes of which you want to be a part. Estimate how much time that's going to take on, say, a weekly or perhaps a monthly basis, and then rearrange things to make time for that. The work of racial justice also requires money. In the Bible, the word tithe means a tenth, and it refers to giving away a tenth of one's earnings toward the work, in this case, of the religious community. But in a similar sense, to orient one's life toward racial justice requires reorienting your budget to give sacrificially. Now, there are lots of ways to do this. There's one wealthy person who sort of did the tithing in reverse. Instead of giving away 10% and living on 90% of his income, he was wealthy enough to give away 90% and live on the 10%. Now, all of us can't do that, but all of us can give sacrificially. Think of what organizations or causes you want to support, especially Black and minority-led institutions. Think about how much you can give, rather than thinking about how little you can give in order to feel good about yourself. And in that sense, give sacrificially. Here's another racial justice practice that helps to orient your entire life toward racism. It's being careful about referencing racists. There is a spoken word artist named Jason Propaganda Petty, and in 2012, he penned a poem named Precious Puritans, in which he says this: would you quote Columbus to Cherokees? Would you quote Cortez to Aztecs, even if their theology was good? It just sings of blind privilege, wouldn't you agree? You're precious Puritans. What Propaganda was getting at is the idea of quoting racists and people who believed in the dehumanization of other people, particularly people of color, and doing so in an uncritical way. Now listen, there's a difference between teaching about these historical figures for educational purposes and teaching them as admirable figures that we should emulate. Now, I'm all for teaching about the full and robust history even if it is ugly or distasteful, even if it includes talking about people who had racist and white supremacist views. But there's a big difference between doing that and lifting up folks who were racist or white supremacist as people to emulate. People such as George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, Robert Louis Dabney, Robert E. Lee, you can go on and on and on, who often get quoted in a positive manner, but their racist views are almost never touched upon. So what I'm saying is, if you quote these folks, then make sure that you tell the whole story. Don't surprise people or try to trick people by hiding this, and make sure that you're informing yourself about the folks you're referencing. Of course, it's not just about being careful when we reference racists. We actually don't have to reference racists at all. What if you learned about different people and different figures who actually advocated for equality, for freedom, for equity in our society? What if you quoted them? And we have to be careful about putting anyone on a pedestal because all of us fall short in many ways. But there are people we can look to as folks who were leaders in the fight against racism and this journey toward racial justice. I always get a little discouraged when I see people platforming racists, by which I mean there are certain figures, individuals, perhaps even institutions that have made their very distasteful and unhelpful racial views known. They haven't repented of those views or changed them, and yet people still refer to them or to their work. I think part of orienting ourselves toward racial justice means refusing to platform racists. Now, some people will decry this as cancel culture, and they don't like that term or the idea of quote unquote canceling people. But what I mean by it is just refusing to support folks whose racist views are well known and haven't been changed. And so what does that mean? It means deplatforming. You don't retweet or quote them. If they are at a conference, you consider not going to that conference. You don't buy their books. You don't do anything that would continue to boost their profile as long as they hold these racist views. Why? Because we need to put creative, constructive pressure on people to change their views for the sake of racial justice. You're not canceling a human being. All you're saying is that you are using your power as a consumer and as someone who also has a platform to lift up people who are advocating for racial justice and equity, and not those who aren't. Another racial justice practice, and this goes especially for racial and ethnic minorities, is to consider taking your talents to a minority-led institution. Howard University is a historically black college. It's a great school, not such a great basketball team. They hadn't been to the NCAA tournament in 30 years. They had won just 4 games in the 2019 basketball season. All of that began to look different when a top basketball recruit named Makur Maker decided to go to Howard University. In explaining his decision, he said, "I need to make the HBCU movement real so that others will follow." What Maker was hoping was that other top basketball recruits would go to an HBCU like he had chosen to. And Maker decided to go to an HBCU because it affirmed his racial and ethnic identity, it affirmed his dignity, and he wanted to be in a college environment like that, even though he had his pick of elite basketball programs that would have taken him to a predominantly white institution. In a similar way, people of color, black people, racial and ethnic minorities, we have talents too. We may not all be top basketball recruits, but we are fundraisers, we are marketing and advertising professionals, we are speakers and preachers. We have an abundance of talent and skills. What if we took that talent and those skills to minority-led organizations? What if our presence in those organizations affirmed the importance of those organizations so that Black-led institutions become the first choice and the top choice for people instead of just predominantly white institutions and organizations? Here's another racial justice practice that gets really personal and perhaps really uncomfortable. We have to reconsider where we send our kids to school. We've talked in prior lessons about equitable funding in schools, but it's not just about the funding, it's about cultivating an attitude toward the common good, which would also include our entire families and even choices like where we send our kids to school. Nicole Hannah-Jones is an investigative journalist who also studies education inequality, and she says this: true integration, true equality requires a surrendering of advantage, and when it comes to our own children, that can feel almost unnatural. As long as people who can afford the costs of segregation choose to send their kids to segregated schools that are racially and ethnically homogenous and also mostly affluent, there is going to continue to be vast inequality in our schools. What are we going to do in our own families to address that inequality? We don't know if the laws will ever change, but we can change our own behavior and our own practices. It may be that your own racial justice journey involves sending your kids to perhaps a less prestigious or economically affluent school in order to write a new story of justice and equity in our public schools. But regardless of where you send your kids to school, or even if you have kids at all, you can be part of bringing racial equity into our schools. I had a relative one time who was going into a meeting with administrators at her child's predominantly white public school. And she texted me to ask me, what questions should she ask in order to ensure racial equity? I sent her the following list of questions that you might ask of schools in your area. Questions like, how and where does the curriculum specifically address Black history, Native American history, and the histories of other people of color? What training do teachers receive in order to provide culturally responsive pedagogy? Are there written protocols and guidelines addressing hate speech and racist incidents at the school? Do you track discipline, suspensions, and expulsions by race and ethnicity? How do those data compare across demographics? And more and more. With some adaptation, you might ask these questions of a club, a sports team, or any number of different organizations. The idea is to hold accountable these organizations and institutions to practices that promote racial justice and equity. Orienting your life toward racial justice requires constant focus, attention, and a daily decision to work toward racial justice. It's not a one-time decision. We all have the responsibility, each day, to take another step on the journey toward racial justice.
So that was orienting our lives toward racial justice. There's a lot there. There's a lot of practical suggestions that Jamar offers. I wanted to just start off with asking if there was a particular part of Jamar's video that resonated with you or stood out to you or just kind of struck you in a certain way. I see Susan Morris.
I just think it's funny that Sue Kelly and I, at least on my screen, are right next to each other.
Yeah.
I was struck by G.K. Chesterton's quote, I am what is wrong with the world. I think that's really profound. And it's so true. I mean, you know, and that's true of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just my thought.
Yeah, it's simple and profound in that it doesn't point away from the person answering, say, well, here, over there is what's wrong with the world, but to say, I'm a part of that in a very simple way to say, I'm a part of that. Susan Kelly.
I particularly like the suggestion, excuse me, to take your talents to a Black-based institution. I think it speaks to the opposite of white supremacy, headset. It's not a white person or group that needs to lead. And I really like that suggestion.
Yeah. Nick.
Yeah, I'd like to back Sue's comment up. I think if you really take this issue seriously, you need to get involved with Black people, whether it's through one of their associations or organizations, a neighbor, somebody who needs help. I think you have to get involved with Black people, especially in the area we live, because it doesn't happen easily. It's different if you're in an urban environment or you're at work and you have Blacks who are at work with you. So here you have to work at it a little more, like in the Westchester or Exton area, but it can be done. And I think only by really being friends with a Black can you really understand what it's been like for them to grow up in America, understand their history, understand the depth of their pain, and try to somehow bridge the gap between whites and Blacks.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, Beth. Oh, you're unmuted, Beth.
Okay. I like the part in particular where he mentioned choosing where your kids go to school. And some of the things that resonated with me, or one in particular, I mean, there were several about education, but one was a disparity that I noticed even before my kids went to school. It was in some news reports and some other studies where African American, Hispanic, Southeast Asians are punished more harshly than whites for the same incident. It's just like the same disparity over certain crimes and prisons and things like that. And when you hear someone say, I teach at this detention center, you wonder where or why these kids are in there. Did they do something the same as someone else might have done, but because of their race, they're punished more harshly, or where they might come from, like a school district with a large population of minorities, and it's automatic. Oh well, we'll punish, and we're going to punish these differently than those, or even when it comes to education, sometimes the truth of education about the United States, like Jamar is covering in both of his books, but let that be in part of the curriculum for the education. And there's just so many things that are watered down. Even what is it, Thanksgiving, the pilgrims and Indians, and that was a bloody massacre when it came to colonization. And there's just a lot of things that are sugar coated or not covered totally, or even enough. You just cover just a little bit, maybe the top 10% of an incident, not with punishment but with education. That sometimes I was reading in a book recently called Blood at the Root. It was about a racial cleansing, Forsyth County, Georgia. And after that time, they wanted to keep that county, and this was up into the late 80s, keep that county white ever since that cleansing in, I think it was the 1800s. It might have been a little bit before that, based on an incident almost like the Emmett Till incident, that someone perceived as something that happened. I think that's an easier way of where things can start and where things can change. You know, whereas I think there's something, and right now it's not like right at the front of my mind, but it's questionable now in one of the states about you know, how things were or what actually happened, and then wanting them to put that into education. I can't think of what it is right now. It might come to me later. And I think the governor doesn't want, you know, that truth be told in education or how things were.
Mhm. Yeah, in Florida, there was I think a law, I think signed recently banning, but it says banning critical race theory, though I question whether people who use that term know what that means or what that is. But we're having a moment here where I think over a dozen states are looking at, or if not have already implemented, certain laws or bills that prohibit schools from teaching the 1619 Project or critical race theory, which are two different things. And critical race theory has become sort of a boogeyman term that makes people think that schools are teaching kids to hate their country, which is not what it is. I trust that we all here kind of know that or understand that. But yeah, you know, as a parent of having two young kids in school, it's at the forefront of my mind as to wondering, okay, what are they going to learn, and where are we going to have to, as parents, you know, maybe step in if we hear them say, you know, we learned this about slavery or Thanksgiving or whatever, and say, okay, well, let's get a fuller story, and we need to sit down and talk a little bit more about what you heard, because we want you to be able to know the truth in a fuller way, so that you can, you know, as a Christian, say, you know, love your neighbor better. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Beth, with education, of just how important it is to know sort of the full story of our history and not just the top 10%.
Right. Yeah.
I see Carol Murray has her hand up.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're good.
Good. Several things hit me. I'm far from having school-age children, but I loved the way he used the filter of questions about the school organization, and that same sort of filter of questions about racism and equality make me think about, you know, how do I look at other things I do? The other two things that struck me were, you know, if I feel that I want to do something, I have to allocate time to it. It's, you know, I can feel that I want to be a part of, but I have to figure out the time to do it. And where does my money go? So the fact there are things I can do. I can look at how I allocate my time. What organizations do I support? How do I look at those organizations that I'm a part of, or I want to contribute to and support, and know that they are striving for racial justice, racial equality, racial education. So those things struck me. I listened to what he said.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And that actually gets at a question I have here too. And that question is, what changes are you considering making to your budget, to budget your time and money toward racial justice? And I even kind of rephrase that question because, you know, for myself as a full-time working parent, sometimes it's easy just to go home and say, okay, we got the dishes done, we got dinner, the kids are in bed, I just want to watch a movie, so put something on the TV. But it got me thinking, you know, how am I spending my evenings? Are there some of those evenings, rather than zoning out in front of the TV, that I could say, okay, I'm going to pursue learning about something regarding this work of racial justice and anti-racism. So yeah, that's the question. What change are you considering making to budget your time and money toward racial justice? And the shorter version of that question is, how are you spending your evenings? And I guess, caveat that I asked that question not to say like anybody who has a full-fledged plan right now, who has their calendar all set out and can share their screen. That's not what I'm asking. Just what are you considering? What are some things that are popping in your mind? Say, yeah, that really resonates to me, and I'd love to support Black businesses more, or find out what's going on in our schools. I see Katie Eels.
Eels, wow, you got it right.
I just barely. I switched at the last second.
Well, we have a lot of Black staff here, and so one thing that I'm going to do is make a major donation to our education fund, which helps lift up students going to school. Maybe they are in a low-level medical aid position, but they might want to become a nurse, or a maintenance guy might want to become a plumber, or whatever. And I think that was something that I would feel really good to do and would bring good. And the other thing that I try to do, we have a monthly newsletter, and that is to submit Black poets' work or something along educational for our community, which is pretty slow about what we're talking about. So I don't want to turn people off, but I do. And the other thing is, at the dining table, to use my voice when I hear subtle or even not so subtle racist comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I love the idea of lifting up poetry by Black writers, and I even expand that to lifting up Black art, or art by people, by non-white people, because I think that's that stuff shapes us. Art shapes us as much as we shape it. So the movies we're watching, the science fiction fantasy novels that we're reading, the poetry we're reading, the music we're listening to, I think all that stuff that maybe we don't, it doesn't seem like, I'm not donating to a cause, or I'm not marching in the streets, or I'm not lobbying my elected officials, but I think that stuff shapes us in subtle ways. So yeah, absolutely.
I would include in that a movie, if you haven't seen it, Concrete Cowboy.
Mm-hmm.
It is a wonderful movie that takes place in Philadelphia, and very much learning about Black culture in our own community.
Yeah. Carol, I see did you raise your hand again? Okay. Anyone else? What you're thinking about or considering? Oh, Judy, I see your hand up.
Just because I was in church today and listening to the Minute from Mission about Bridge Academy, and I got to thinking about some of the outreach ministries that we already have connections with that I know very little about. Once a year I get backpacks and put things in backpacks. And it got me thinking about my grandchildren. There are 4 of them, 3 of who are in school, who it's a big shopping event for them to go out, buy their back to school clothes, buy their backpacks, buy all the equipment that goes in those backpacks. And I'm trying to think about how different it is for them than probably a lot of kids who will get the backpacks, where that kind of money means maybe that money needs to go someplace else. And it got me thinking about just And I had, you know, about researching Bridge Academy. I live in Exton. I'm not that far from Bridge Academy. Are there programs, or they have reading programs for little ones where I could go and read? It's making me think about where I can plug in even to the things we are already involved with, the food bank, Good Works. You know, Patty, I think you mentioned about, you know, just grandmas, and here's the grandma, you know, sitting around with another grandma and having a conversation. And it's just a new area for me to be thinking about. But we already, and I know, Chris, you used to take kids, I don't know how much, certainly not during the pandemic, but there's been a connection with the Bridge Academy, which would be one place that money, certainly money would help, and things like going out and buying the backpacks and filling them.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't taken kids as much this past year and a half, just because of the pandemic conditions. But yeah, that's a wonderful ministry there, and we've been, you know, involved for a few years. And the other one, there's another one in Coatesville that I'm blanking on the name of the overarching organization, but they're an organization that they kind of empower different initiatives. So people in the community come to them with an idea, and they help them develop it, and then kind of it comes under the umbrella of again, this organization I am blanking on off the top of my head, but they have a program called Coatesville Kids to College, and the idea is to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. And they start early. They start in like pre-K, and right now I think they go through maybe elementary school, and I think they're starting middle school. But I've been in contact with their director of how we can start getting involved with that. And so, yeah, there may be something on the horizon in our connection there too, that you may be able to get involved in. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Nick.
I just wanted to point out to everyone that there are 2 shows on TV now that deal with racial issues from a comedy point of view. One is Bob Abshaloa, I can't pronounce his name, but he's married to a Black woman from an African country. And so they not only talk about race in this country, but also it has an international bent as well. The other one is called The Neighborhood, where there's a young white couple that lives next to a middle-aged Black couple. And it's about their struggles trying to be friends and understand each other. And, you know, it's modeled after All in the Family, which started all of this, you know, with Archie Bunker and Carol Connor played that point. But sometimes comedy in a non-threatening way can make some very interesting points. And it's done so you're not threatened. It's done so you actually look at what the issue is in somewhat of an objective fashion. So, you know, if you're inclined that way, I would encourage you to watch both those shows, because they deal with it, and they deal with it intelligently.
Yeah. I see Betsy's hand.
I agree with what Nick's saying. I think approaching some of this from a humorous point of view, and they deal with some problems that are very significant, and they bring the humor out of. I watched both of those shows. I think they're excellent, very well written. And one of the things I've learned is not only professionally, because I actually had to take a teacher's course in African-American culture, which was very revealing to me, because I was dealing with Black kids all the time in school, but also my family. There's all these cultural differences that we don't really understand. Just a stupid thought came into my head. My son-in-law, obviously, who's African American, doesn't like my potato salad. Okay, it's my potato salad, and he doesn't like it because his grandma made it entirely different than me. And it really was hurtful to me for a long time to recognize the fact that he wasn't insulting me. It's a cultural difference and it's okay. And, you know, we got two kinds of potato salad now because I like mine, he likes his grandma. So, but, and also different things like that, that we, you know, that we take, we don't understand. And then we condemn because you don't like my grandma's potato salad better than yours. You know, that's the thing that we need to think about. We need to think about how we look at, judge, and accept others' point of view. And African Americans' point of view culturally is entirely different than ours, entirely. And I work hard at embracing that. I want my grandsons to understand they come from two wonderful traditions, not just one. And I agree with somebody made the comment about the history. That is huge. Not whitewashing history, not teaching all, you know, like the accepted stuff we all got in high school, but really looking at some of these other things and what were those people actually doing in their real lives? Okay, what were they actually doing? They might have been the founding fathers, but what were they actually doing in their lives? And what does that say to us? And to understand their humanity in it, okay, to understand their humanity, but to think about, well, maybe that wasn't so great at all, and that's how we kind of got to where we are now. But we don't have to accept that. We can change that and make it different. And yes, they were great contributors to America and to our, but let's think about all the other folks who were also great contributors, who were marginalized for whatever reason. And, you know, my big thing is Native Americans, tremendous. Nobody teaches Wounded Knee, you know, nobody teaches that. And that's something we need to consider including in our heritage. Okay, what a horrible thing it was. And what are those people doing? I'm on websites with those folks. They're doing incredible things now. And that's something we need to think about and support. And so are African Americans.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, I see Patty.
Hi. I urge us, it comes up from time to time, but I urge us to get more involved with Coatesville. You know, it's right up the road and there's all kinds of incredible ministries, nonprofit ministries. There's a ministerium. There's pastors that are so powerful and so wise. Instead of just looking locally, Westchester, Exton, when I applied for Good Works 27 years ago, I didn't even know where Coatesville was. I did not know anything. It was like traveling to another distant place when it's really just up the road. So whatever you were trying to remember, I can't remember either. I'm not sure I know what you were referring to, but connecting with somebody in that community can lead us to other people. And, you know, we're already involved with Good Works. We're already involved with Bridge Academy. We're already involved with Chester County Women's Services. There's a number of incredible ministries there that are longstanding and doing great work. So I just want to offer that's a resource that maybe we're not plugging into as fully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was actually just trying to Google. I still can't find it. It's just completely can't rack my brain. But yeah, you know, it doesn't take far off our sort of our front step, I'll say, of our community to, you know, and encounter less white spaces and less white communities. And Coatesville being one of them.
Chester.
Yeah. I'll sort of make a shameless plug here. You know, one way, if anyone's ever interested, we're trying to rework our confirmation curriculum this year. Betsy Ballantyne is actually helping as someone who has written curriculum for a long time, and shaping it to, in some ways, be more anti-racist, or to include that in as a part of the curriculum. So connecting theological conversations to things that are happening in our world and some of the history of our country and the world, so that our students, in their affirmation of their baptism, have been led through those conversations, and they have pondered that, and they have been spiritually formed to see that this kind of stuff is important, that when they're baptized or they're confirming their baptism, in some ways it is baptism into the work of anti-racism, what I would say is the work of Christ toward reconciliation. So that's my shameless plug. We're looking for Credo leaders for next year. If anyone's ever interested in leading a group of young people through that, and in again, sort of mixing in anti-racism work or conversations, feel free to reach out to me. One question I want us to ponder before we do the final concluding video. I can't remember off the top of my head if Jamar talks about this in the video, but in the book he talks about canceling contempt, and he cautions against, in this work, we can sometimes find ourselves feelings of sort of a superiority of, oh, I know more about the world history than you, and I can't believe you don't talk about this stuff, or you speak this way, or use this racist term, or how could you possibly think that this country is equal now, racism doesn't exist, and he talks about how contempt is not what we're shooting for. And I just jotted some notes about how contempt tempts us to shame others, and shaming has never cultivated healthy transformation in anyone in the history of the entire world. So my question for you to ponder is, how will you posture yourself to engage in anti-racism work without shaming others? How can we posture ourselves without not speaking the hard truths that we need to speak, but doing it in love without shame? How could you posture yourself in that way to do anti-racism work and engage it and orient your life around it without shaming others? If one or two people, yeah, I'll do Susie and then Nancy, or sorry, Susan and then Nancy.
I liked suggestions that Jamar gave. I think listening with your mouth clenched shut is really crucial, at least for me. And then asking, where is the source, and then trading sources of information, and hopefully, encouraging the person to broaden their information input. But I think just as important, it's to know when to let it go. I know Ernie Kimmel gave it a series of classes in civility, and that was way back with the political tug of war. And it's, if you try to convince someone that you're right and they're wrong, the heels dig in, and it actually undermines your good intentions.
Yeah. And then Nancy McCabe.
Yeah, I don't think you should start any conversation or sentence with "you should." Instead, I think listening and then asking questions about their feelings, and open-ended ones, so it's not just a yes or a no answer, but never say "you should."
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm going to, sorry, I just remember off the top of my head what the name of that organization is, and I put it in the chat if you would like to check it out. It's Hope Beyond Borders in Coatesville. We're gonna watch the final video, which is only about, I think, 4 or 5 minutes. And then we'll talk briefly about a statement through several people in this group and seen by the pastors and myself, a statement on racial justice. So let's watch the final closing video here. Wait a second.
I began this study by talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement. She dedicated her life toward equity and justice, yet her life ended on a somber note. She didn't have much money, and for all the people she influenced, there were relatively few people around at the end of her life. She was plagued by chronic illnesses, and furthermore, many of the causes that she spent her life pursuing were less than successful. Voting rights were still under attack. In her home area of the Delta, people were still disproportionately poor. What I hope we have learned throughout this study is that we can't measure success purely by laws passed or which officials get elected, that this struggle against racism and this journey toward racial justice isn't just about how it changes the world, but how it changes you. As I have moved further along in this journey of racial justice, I've become more deeply aware of three realities. More deeply aware of God's presence, of the community of co-laborers, and of myself. Fannie Lou Hamer put it this way. She said, "It's a funny thing. Ever since I started working for Christ, it's like the 23rd of Psalms. Thou anointeth my head, and you prepare a table for me in the presence of mine enemies." She understood, like I have come to understand, that when the fight against racism is the hardest, when it feels the most difficult, that's when I feel God's presence the most closely. Not only that, I've discovered that I'm not alone on this journey, that in this struggle against racism, there are other like-minded people. And in a very real sense, my church and my community of support has moved beyond my local location, beyond the local congregation, and it includes people across this continent and even across the world who are on a similar journey. I have found co-laborers in the struggle for justice. And of course, on this journey, I've learned more about me. I've learned that I am far more fragile than I'd like to admit. I get tired, I get frustrated, I get angry, but I've also discovered deep reservoirs of strength that I never knew existed until I got on this journey toward racial justice. This can all be true for you too. To the trepidatious, to those who fear getting on this journey, I say to you, the only way to grow is to go. Get started. The steps don't have to be big, but if you persevere, then those baby steps can become long strides toward freedom. To those intrepid travelers who have already been on this journey, I say to you, you are already effective. Think about how many people throughout history have chosen compromise and complicity, but you have chosen to fight racism, to get on this path and to stay on it. And in it, you are already victorious. You are already effective. You are already faithful. We can't give up. We're people of hope. Hope is not blind optimism. Hope is a realistic assessment of things as they are, with the faith that things can be different. We are people who believe that the brutal, unjustified murder of a poor carpenter from Nazareth resulted in a resurrection. We are people who believe we can join in this victory through faith. Each day we have the opportunity to live this resurrection life and to put on display the hope that we have. The journey for racial justice continues, but the music we hear along the way is not a funeral dirge. It's festival music, leading us to a banquet of blessings and a harvest of righteousness. Today is the day, and now is the time to fight racism and to join in this journey toward racial justice.
So, I love that last line. Hope is not blind optimism. Hope is a realistic assessment of things as they are, with the faith that things can be different. And I like that idea of thinking of that's what we're bearing witness to. We're bearing witness to hope. It's bearing witness to what is and having faith that things can be different. So I just want to open up to maybe hear from 2, maybe 3 people of what of Jamar's encouragement in that last video will stick with you, and maybe a little bit of why. Susan, do you have your hand up, or is that left up? Susan Kelly. That's all right. I just want to make sure I wasn't missing you.
Actually, I was trying to keep my mouth shut, so maybe I just won't. I particularly was very thankful for his last statements of hope and faith. But I feel very saddened that this series has come to a conclusion. I think of things like, never forget the Holocaust, or what's happened to the indigenous people on every continent. The truth of US history and slavery and those horrors. And I think as a white person, there's a balance there to continue that deep, heartfelt push to be determined, to find the time to take action. So that's it.
Thank you. Nick.
I think in a lot of these matters, it's important to listen to our hearts as well as our minds. And I do believe that Jesus talks to us at times and leads us when we're really praying a lot about certain kinds of issues. And I'm going to give a very personal example. I was contacted by a middle-aged Black man about 10 months ago. And he said, I've read about you on LinkedIn and Facebook, and I followed some of the things you've done with survey research. And I'd like you to be a companion with me because I'm dying. I'm dying of different forms of cancer, and I go to the Mayo Clinic in Minneapolis, that's where he lives, every week. And I turned him down twice for a number of reasons. But then, I prayed about it, and I really heard Jesus say to me, Nick, what are you doing? You've been trained to do this. You went through the Stephen Minister program at Westminster. This fellow needs help. And so I contacted him and I said, I don't know how this is going to go, but let's talk and we'll see what happens. And we've developed such a close relationship that we literally text message each other every day. I try to set an hour aside a week to talk with him on the phone. I can't tell you how much I've gotten from him in terms of strength, understanding the Black experience. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We've talked about the protest. We've talked about the demonstrations. He doesn't like to talk about his illness so much. And so, I follow his lead on these things. But I would have missed out on a tremendous friendship with a Black person if I hadn't listened to that little voice in my heart from God that said, do this. And I can't begin to tell you how much I've learned from him and how I've learned to be stronger myself and how you do that when you know you're dying. I am amazed at his strength of character, his morals. He has a very close relationship with his Baptist pastor. They have lunch every couple of weeks, so he's very strong spiritually. But it's just a wonderful relationship, and I would have missed out on so much if I hadn't done this. But like everybody else, I was very suspicious about being contacted online. I wondered what angle he was playing. And it turned out to be a graceful, God-sending calling that I'm just so glad I didn't turn my back.
Thanks for sharing that, Nick. We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to make sure that we included just some acknowledgement and maybe very, very brief conversation. But I don't know how many weeks ago or past the class, a group of people from this class decided to try and formulate a sort of statement on racial justice for our congregation, for Westminster. I know a few people. I know Ann McNally was on that group. And Susan Morris, Betsy Valentine, Nick, Nancy McCabe. Am I missing anyone? So to make sure. Okay, and Carolyn and Paul, Susan Kelly. So we had a small group from this larger group begin to put together a racial justice statement, and then it was sent to the pastors, and we did sort of some editing or additions, and then we sent it back, and there were some even briefer edits that were put together, and so we now have this statement on racial justice that let me share my screen here. So this is what we have here, and I won't read through the whole thing. I'll just wanted to read through the part specifically about how we at Westminster hope to engage in this work as a part of just sort of a natural part of our ministry. Like, this is who we are about. So we have written here, tragically, we have fallen short in the work of justice. America has deep roots in systemic racism. The white Christian church has too often been complicit in this tradition. Westminster's commitment is to recognize these roots and better understand how we have been compromised by them. Entering into this holy work, we seek to faithfully participate in dismantling the structures of racism in the church and the world in hopes of a more just and equitable future for all. When we've connected it to a statement by the PCUSA and sort of some history of what we've been doing. I don't know, Don or Jenny or Ann, if there's anything in particular you would like to share about this, as sort of what next steps are.
So this statement, we've gotten it, and I sent it out in an email to all of you. Hopefully you got it. If you didn't get it, send me an email. I'll send it to you. If you had any thoughts or feedback for it, but we also want to share it with people that we know from our congregation who participated in the 21-day racial equity challenge back last June, as well as those people who participated in the Color of Compromise class, which we did at the beginning of the year. Just so that there's more people who we know who have been engaged with this study of racial justice and kind of the history of racism, and learning about how do we be anti-racist, for them to see it as well. And, if they have any thoughts or whatnot. When we make sure that we've gotten some feedback from people, and then we want to take it, and if there's tweaking that needs to be done, or if we feel like it's kind of in a form that we feel like most people thought it was a good form, the next step will be that we will take it to the session, and who are the elders in the church. And what we would like to be able to say is, this came out of, this many people that studied, in these classes, who participated in the 21-day racial equity challenge, so that there's kind of some weight to it, that this is, a group in the church who would like to bring this to session for their review, their discussion, and hope, our prayers that ultimately that they will approve it, that would become part of what Westminster states about ourselves, that would go on our website. So, and then we also want to, on the website, wherever we would post, that also include things that we are doing, ways that we are trying to do this work. And as Jamar said, we're not like done the class and go like, well, that was nice. This is our challenge, that we continue this work. And we've been trying to allow the Holy Spirit to lead us. And I think we're listening, and I have no doubt that new things will bubble up that we will have opportunity to engage with as the church, certainly as our individual lives be doing that too. But we don't want to just put this to bed and say, well, gee, we did our part and now we'll move on to something else. So, we hope this will become part of the DNA of our church. That was several lessons ago where Jamar said it's hard, when an organization's already started to bake in the DNA that maybe wasn't baked in at the beginning, which is sort of where we are. But we also want to do our part to try to integrate this into the DNA of Westminster. I don't know if Don wants to say any more, Anne.
Yeah, so the thing is, Jenny said, we'll if we need to, we will send this around again via email, and yeah, our hopes is that we would get a significant number of people who can be on board with it at its outset. So, well, I just want to be conscious of our time. I know we're a little over, but I wanted to close this with a prayer from another prayer book called Rhythm of Prayer. It's a collection of prayers by a diversity of women. And this prayer is called A Prayer for When We've Lost Our Way Again, by Enuma Okoro, who is a Nigerian American speaker and writer. And I thought this was just suitable because as we said, this isn't the end of a journey. We're going to continue on this, and we may lose our way at different points along the journey. But this is a prayer and call back to our calling as disciples when that does happen. So this is a prayer for when we've lost our way again. Merciful Lord, sometimes it seems like we can't help but lose our way again and again. Our hearts long to follow you, but you know the way of the human heart. You know how in our misguided longings, we veer off our journeying to you and begin to chart our own ways by false stars and distorted visions. Forgive us. Forgive us for all the times we are tempted by the hints of light instead of remaining steered by the assurance of light. Forgive us when we forget that we are already claimed by you, loved by you, and purposed for you. Forgive us when we allow ourselves to shape and be shaped by voices and words that do not bring life, create life, nurture life, sustain life, or resurrect life. Merciful God, help us to find our way again. Turn us back toward the road spotted with your other pilgrims, wayfarers, and repentant servants. Remind us that your way is the way of returning. Guide us by your Spirit and by your light. Make us remember the power of the Spirit within us. Make us remember the gifts of our minds, our hearts, and our bodies that you have bestowed on us, that we would use them to honor the directives and invitations you lay upon us. We know that our ways are not your ways, and we thank you for this. Help us trust your ways over our ways. Remind us of your faithfulness as you forgive us our short memory. In your immeasurable love, grace, mercy, and wisdom, do not abandon us, regardless of how often we lose our way. Place your wounded hands upon our broken hearts and turn us towards you, Lord of light, Lord of the life, Lord of resurrection. Amen.
Before everybody goes, a couple things. One is Juneteenth is coming up next Saturday. And if you were part of worship this morning, you heard John speak about that. And there is a link Ann McNally found for us of Juneteenth ways that Westchester is observing that. So we'll try to get that link out to the congregation. So if you are interested in joining in any of those ways of marking Juneteenth, that you'll see how you can. The other thing I said at the beginning, not everybody was on yet, but Ernie and Gabrielle Kimmel's friend Michelle, who does give tours for the Kennett Underground Railroad, we're trying to put a tour together with her. So once we've settled on the date, it'll either be in June or July. We will get that information to you, and if you're interested, to let us know, because we'll be using a bus, and depending what size bus we're going to need. But I just want to thank you all for being part of this, and just a plug, our next class preaching series starts next week on the Presbyterian Confessions. And I see some dovetailing of what we've been talking about in this class, in the color compromise out of our confessions that we have in our church too. So, you know, we will be weaving, I think, as we discuss, you know, the confessions, some of what we've been talking about all along here as well. So let us continue the conversation in this study.
Thank you all so much for joining us. for this
Yes.
book study.
Thanks for leading. This has
Yeah.
been wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, everybody.